Hi, welcome to session 3 of Native American History, Culture, and Religion up to 1492. So, in this session, we're going to continue with the stages of development that we have been discussing in the previous sessions of Native American peoples going through thousands and thousands and thousands of years of history, adapting to different environments in the American continent, but in the process going through certain stages of development that took them from very distinct phases of adaptation and tool making and even creating their own distinct religious worldviews in the process. So far, we have discussed the Stone Age. We discussed that thoroughly in previous sessions. The hunters and gatherers were their animistic worldview in their animal religious beliefs and practices, their animal cults. And then we started also moving into the next stage after the Stone Age around 8000 BC, which was the age of horticulture, the early stages of farming, domestication of wild plants in the Americas. We're talking about corn, beans, and squash. We talked about that fully. The creation of communities and settlements and villages, and also how during that age that spanned for about 5,000 years, from 8,000 to 3,500 BC, women dominated that world. And this happened not only in the American continent, but virtually everywhere in the world. Those indeed are world ages, by the way. The Stone Age, the Horticultural Age. So those are ages of humanity that peoples from around the world were experiencing simultaneously at different rates. Of course, they're not really at the same stage of development, but give and take, those are eras in which particularly humans are living in those conditions that I just mentioned. So yeah, in the Horticultural Age, women dominated every aspect of society. They dominated the village, the family, and also the religious beliefs and rituals were also carried out by women. There were the scientists, the medicine doctors, the healers, and even the religion itself, again, was oriented towards the feminine side of divinity, the goddess. So all rituals were really carried out to produce or enhance fertility. Now, we're now moving into the next stage of development. Let me put the slide now. Okay. And after the Horticultural Age, we're going to now enter a new historical stage of development that Native Americans, of course, entered around 3500 BC, very slowly, very gradually, but all around the world, we're going to see that other societies, other groups are also experiencing a similar transition towards agriculture. Okay, so this was a world era that begins roughly about 3500 BC with the innovation of new knowledge, new techniques, new tools that allowed human beings to actually maximize the production of crops, the production of food from the land. Okay, so agriculture differs from horticulture in one way, and that is that now we're looking at mass production, okay, enhancing, increasing productivity of the land to the maximum capacity. So instead of just growing some crops on gardens the way it was done in the past, now human beings are going to prepare hundreds and hundreds of acres for cultivation, the cultivation of certain crops, certain staples that are going to sustain large populations that are now going to live in cities. Okay, they're not going to live in villages. Of course, there's going to be village life. There's no doubt about that. So this is very important to note at this point, that not just because we're moving into a new era, for example, the age of agriculture, that means that all human beings on the face of the earth are experiencing this transition towards agriculture. There's still people that remained as hunters and gatherers. They did not really move into the village life in 8000 BC, in that era, the horticultural era. And there's still a lot of people, again, that are continuing their way of life of hunters and gatherers, and they remain in forest, they remain in certain jungles, for example, whether we're talking about jungles of South America, certain areas of Africa or Australia, for example, is very common. Now there's still hunters and gatherers, of course, and likewise, again, as we move into the age of agriculture, not every villager that cultivates crops in gardens, they're horticulturalists, that is to say, not all of them are going to move into cities. Not all of them are going to start, working the land in a very intensive way, and now participating in this agricultural revolution, because that's exactly what it is. Again, in 3500 BC, what begins to happen is that we're entering now a revolution called the agricultural revolution. It's a revolution in agriculture that is happening simultaneously in different parts of the globe, by the way, as a result of, as I mentioned, the introduction of new knowledge, new technologies, new strategies for maximizing output, agricultural output, by the way. So, overall, when we talk about this agricultural revolution, we're talking about, for example, the introduction of irrigation systems. So this is first and foremost the first development, the first piece of knowledge or strategy that human beings develop, and that is people realize that in order to grow more food, you need a reliable source of water. So instead of relying on the blessings of nature, that is rain, people decided to simply move towards the largest rivers that were available to them, and once nearby those rivers, they decided to build canals or certain waterways. It was called irrigation systems, to divert water from the river, out of the river, into their own fields, and in that way you'll have access to water year round. Okay, so this is the first strategy or knowledge that people introduced. In the rest of the world, outside of the Americas, we see the coming of the Iron Age. So when we talk about, for example, Asia, places like China, for example, India, the Middle East, it's called Mesopotamia, that civilization, or Egypt, for example, what we see very early on is that human beings are going to discover this mineral, iron ore, and smelt it and work with it and start creating tools. So this is the beginning of the Iron Age. The agricultural age coincided also with the Iron Age, and some of the tools that people crafted in the old world, again outside of the American continent, to aid agricultural production was the plow. Okay, the plow. And the plow is going to be tied to a beast of burden, like an ox or cattle, for example, in order to till the land. Okay, in order to plow it, to till it, and then in that way, you can actually prepare the field for the planting of the seed. So it will be faster and easier to use this new technology, again, animal power with the plow, and with that, it was almost like the first tractor. So, think of it that way, okay? Of course, it's not a machine, it's still an animal, but it was a tractor in the most essential term of the word, in essential understanding, if you will. So those tools, that knowledge, those innovations were introduced in order to create a revolution in agriculture, so people could actually produce more food year round. Again, so this indicates that as people are moving to the rivers, the largest rivers of the planet, in order to grow crops on a large scale, they're going to now build their large societies, which over time will become the greatest and the very first and greatest civilizations of the planet. Okay, so this is the rise of world civilizations. Okay, so we're talking about 3500 BC. So the agricultural age, besides coinciding with the birth of the Iron Age, it also produced all of the civilizations of the world that we know of. So the oldest civilizations in existence go back 5,000-6,000 years of history. Okay, for example, China, India, the Middle East, they're the oldest in existence, that continue pretty much their civilizations in the present. Another important, of course, understanding here is that when we talk about civilizations, we're talking about cities. So that's what a civilization is really the birth, the coming of the city, life in the city. So civilizations means that humans are now going to be moving towards areas to live together, and in that area they're going to create a city. They're going to build the city, and so inside of the city, of course, as we'll see, human beings are going to produce all of their systems of knowledge that we have inherited from the past, of course, whether we're talking about mathematics or we're talking about astronomy, medicine, writing systems, and so on and so forth, including the arts, for example. Many of the artistic fields are going to be crafted, developed in those cities as well. Okay, so you can see in this map these river civilizations, as they're called by historians, the greatest civilizations that came into being with the agricultural revolution, are called the river civilizations because they're emerging from the largest river systems of the world for the reasons I already outlined. So in the Americas, in the American continent, we're also going to see, of course, the birth of civilizations, occurring simultaneously with the other civilizations of the world. But in the Americas, we're not going to see the development of iron per se. So we're not going to see Native Americans entering the Iron Age because the geography of the American continent was very different in that the iron ore, this mineral that is required to create iron, was not easily available in the environment. Not that they did not have the capacity or the intelligence to develop it, it's just that it was hidden, is buried, in other words. It had to be mined, in other words. Whereas in the rest of the world, in the old world, there were huge deposits of iron ore easily available on the surface in the land, in the surface of the earth. People could simply detect it, see it, and just easily gather it. It was given to them by nature, if you will. So in the Americas, we're not going to see that. Okay, so the other thing is, so the plow is not going to be used in the Americas, okay, for the creation of agriculture. And the other, of course, ingredient that made possible the agricultural revolution outside of America was the animal power, the ox, the cattle that people used in order to plow the land. Those animals, those species of animals, are not present in America. So there's no horses, there's no cattle, for example. There's in the American continent. So we might ask ourselves then, if they don't have a plow and animals, how is it that Native Americans made the transition towards agriculture? And the answer is labor, of course, intensive use of human labor. So instead of relying on those tools like iron, plow, and animals, Native Americans are simply going to organize themselves in a way that they're going to be commissioned by their leaders who were considered to be divine beings, like gods, for example, divine kings. We're going to talk about that. And those divine kings commanded labor on such a grand scale that all people worked together. And the another factor that brought people together was kinship. Kinship, in other words, that among Native American societies we see the continuation of this form of social organization that we find that it was so characteristic among Native Americans, that is called kinship. Kin groups, people who live together and who share familial connections, familial bonds, because of birth, because they were born into the group, or because they were married into the group. And so this is how Native Americans organize. They work as families, for example. So therefore, because they see themselves as sharing the same past, the same ancestors, and the same bonds, they're going to actually work together, of course, to work the land in a very intensive way. And of course, they're going to be led by kings who claim to, status of divinity, that he claimed to be the descendants of the sun god, or the planet Venus, and some other gods that people worship. And so that was also another factor. And again, is that how they organized themselves, and how they were also led, again, by leaders to do all the work that needed to be done, not only in the world of agriculture, but also in creating the cities that are going to be built in this new phase. Again, China, India, Mesopotamia, Egypt, the forerunners of the very first civilizations, but also in the Americas, we're going to see civilizations arising in places like Middle America, in South Mexico, Central America, and also in South America as well. So let us now see the Native American civilization. All right, so now let's look at the Native American civilizations that flourished in the agricultural revolution and see some of their major characteristics. There will be significant social and cultural transformations taking place. Number one, of course, with the expansion of corn-based agriculture. So significant change is taking place. The crop that was selected to be used to construct the cities and all of the civilizations of the Americas, the grand civilizations, was corn. I mentioned this is a very complete staple. It has all the nutrients that a human being needs. And this is the crop that was harvested, grown and harvested all across the Americas. By the way, by the villagers that we discussed, the horticulturalists, but now this is going to be done on such a large scale by the agriculturalists who are going to be building their civilizations, their big cities. And so there was a technique that Native Americans discovered or developed from their observations of the natural environment that was used to regenerate the soil, because one of the problems with intensive agriculture that all farmers, all agriculturalists faced, and they're facing even today, is the problem of mineral depletion, soil depletion. So in other words, when you start extracting a lot of products from the land year after year after year, those plants actually have to be nourished. They have to absorb the minerals from the ground in order to grow. So at some point, after 2, 3, perhaps even 5 years of intensive farming, what happens is that the soil starts running out of those nutrients. So in the old world, when people use animals, by the way, things like cattle, etc., people use actually grazing. They grazed animals, okay, in certain areas before cultivating in that area. So they will graze cattle for a number of years, and of course the droppings, the manure of the animals have minerals. This is it's a fertilizer, in other words. So by grazing animals in certain regions and just staying those animals in that region, what you're doing is just fertilizing it. Then once it's fertilized, you move there, you take the animals out, and then you start actually growing food for a number of years, and then you move to another area where you move the animals to. Again, you pretty much are kind of rotating, if you will. There's like a rotation system taking place in the old world, and so you're just kind of preparing cultivation, if you will, by grazing animals in certain regions and rotating back and forth. So this was a very essential strategy used in the old world, but here in the Americas there are no animals. People used to graze the land. To fertilize it, again, to graze animals so they can actually fertilize the ground. So Native Americans discovered that all of the minerals that the land requires for cultivation are contained in the foliage, in the vegetation. And that's exactly what cattle does, by the way, in other parts of the world. They eat, of course, the grass, and the grass contains the minerals, and when they process it, and of course they release the droppings and so on, that's what they're releasing is the nutrients of the grass, by the way, which is fertilizer. So what the Native Americans discovered was that one way to transfer the minerals from the leaves, from the vegetation, from the foliage of the land was by burning the vegetation. Okay, so they will, what they did was slash the vegetation in an area that they wanted to cultivate, leave the slashed, bushes and so on and so forth there to wither, to dry up for a few weeks, and once it was dried, they will set it on fire, and by setting the leaves on fire, the minerals will drop to the ground along with the ash. And so now the land was ready for cultivation for 3, 4, 5 years at the max, and they did that, in a rotation system, very similar to the rotation system of the old world, in that they would use the land for a while, for a few years, grow corn, and once they couldn't grow corn anymore because the land was exhausted, they will slash the vegetation in some other area, and continue this process, and let that land in which they cultivated in the first stage that they slash and burn, of course, they will let that area rest for about 20 years. They will not come back to that spot, not until about like 20 years later. So this was a very useful strategy for letting the soil to replenish and regenerate. And this was practiced pretty much across the Americas, from Canada all the way to South America. This was a technique that Native Americans practiced to regenerate the soil in areas that require, also new life. Even forests that were also considered to be dying because they were not receiving proper rain. There's too much foliage, for example, too many leaves, and it's not allowing, of course, the water to go into the ground. They will simply burn certain areas for that area to be revitalized or regenerated. Again, so corn, beans, and squash were the main staples of the Native American diet, the Holy Trinity, as some scholars call it. It provided all the energy, the proteins, the minerals, the vitamins, etc., required for people to work and be healthy, and to work and to thrive. Once again, so this is going to be something that we're going to see all over the Americas. Different varieties of corn were grown. There are over 100 different varieties, by the way, of corn in the Americas, of all colors, by the way. About over 50 different varieties of beans, and dozens, of course, of varieties of squash as well. Another very important change with the rise of Native American civilizations, number 2, is what's called demographic growth. Of course, once you start cultivating the land in a very intensive way to extract as much products as possible, by moving into, of course, in rivers, and building irrigation canals and irrigation networks, consequently, more food available means more population, demographic growth. There's going to be an increase of population. So instead of people living in small villages of 500 people, perhaps even 1,000 or 2,000 people, the way they lived in the past, now we're going to see an increase, a significant increase in that the cities that are emerging now, they're going to house tens of thousands of people. We're looking anywhere between 20,000 to 80,000. Again, so the smallest city will be about 20,000 people, but some cities reached about 80,000, and there's indications that at some point they surpassed the 100,000 mark, by the way, in certain cases again. So from our standard, they're not that significant, because we're living now in cities that house millions of people, but for this age, this was monumental. Okay, this presumably this has never happened in human history. So this was, a very important development, a very important change that people experienced. Living people, together with other tens of thousands again of members there in the city. So what that led to is urbanism. This is another feature of the civilizations. The urban areas, urban centers. The rise of urban centers is what we mean by cities, in other words. In that people are not just crowded together in areas, and villages are coming together and creating large populations, but they're gonna be, of course, living in something new, in something that will be called a city. Some people live in the outskirts of the city. Some people live very close or in the inner city, if you will. I mean, those are, again, gigantic areas that were constructed in a way that there were, peasants living there. There were merchants, artisans, doing artwork, so on. Of course, the administrators, the priests, the kings, and so on and so forth again. So they're going to be all living together again in something called the urban areas or cities. So this is very important. This is another feature of the rise of Native American civilizations. Number 4. Once in the city, as I mentioned in the very beginning of this session, is that we're now going to see the formulation of the advanced systems of knowledge. What we call science. Okay, science is just a body of knowledge that has been accumulated over hundreds and hundreds of years, and that constitute what today we call science or knowledge. Okay, so it is here that not only in the Americas but all over the world, when we see the rise of civilizations, what people are doing is that they're now spending a lot of time to ponder about the world around them. Okay, they're going to now spend time thinking, in other words, about how everything works, why the world is what it is, what really, we need to know about medicine for healing ailments, for example. How do we know, the effects of certain phenomenons like eclipses and so on and so forth? So people are going to be observing nature significantly. They're going to be making notes, and from those observations and notations, they're going to be, of course, developing things like writing. So all of the writing systems are being developed all over the world. Native Americans created their own distinct systems of writing in which they use primarily symbols. Okay, symbols that pretty much communicated a series of ideas. So instead of using letters, to write down words and so on and so forth, the way other languages were constructed, around the world, certain signs and certain symbols that together constitute words, and those words can be read, in a script. The Native Americans actually used a different system, of course, and that's symbolism, certain symbols that pretty much told an entire story. Perhaps 1,000 words were contained in that symbol. So it's a different type of writing system, by the way, that only the people of knowledge, the scientists, the priests, could read, by the way. But they used that to tell the stories of creation, the origins of the universe, the origins of the group, the history of the group, important events, the history of the rulers, when they came to power, perhaps when they migrated to the area, the years, and so on and so forth. So they did, of course, created those writing systems, but they were very unique, very different from the other systems of the world. So it is here that people are crafting and creating knowledge. And the reason for that is because now there's plenty of time to think. Okay? Life in the city changed many things in that the people that live there, particularly the administrators, the priests, for example, the rulers, who are actually commanding people to work in many different areas, they're going to have plenty of time to contemplate, to think, to inquire, to research, because there's plenty of food. The age of agriculture made possible to produce so much food that people could actually store it. There were underground chambers, if you will, that people built to store all the grain of an entire year's harvest. And they're going to be using that again to administering it, if you will, to make it last for an entire year. And so people are not that worried about food. They're not that worried. I mean, they are, but they're not as preoccupied with food as the peoples of the past were. They were always on the go, the hunters and gatherers. They were always worried about survival. They couldn't think about anything. The horticulturalists could indeed think, about issues surrounding them and so on, just because they were settled communities and so on. But now there's plenty of food that could be produced, that can be stored for an entire year. So that means you are going to use your mind for other endeavors. Instead of just worrying about food all the time, you're going to spend your time inquiry. Okay, now let's think. Okay, what are the stars? What is the sun? What is the effect of the sun on the earth? Why there's eclipses? What happens during eclipse? There's a lunar eclipse. There's a solar eclipse. Okay, so what happens? Let me make a note. So they began observing that eclipses did indeed had certain effects on people, had certain effects on agriculture, on the life of animals and insects. And so they were beginning to pay attention to that. And by paying attention to the sky, the Native Americans are going to be really very, very concerned with the sky. They're going to be creating their system of mathematics because they're counting the days. What is the day between one full moon and another? How many days transpire between one solar eclipse and another? Okay? How many days transpire in a whole solar year? Okay? The 4 seasons. Summer, spring, summer, fall, and winter. Okay, so how many days? So they're going to be counting, and when they're counting, they're creating a mathematical notation system. Okay, system of mathematics, and that system was used to create calendars. They were astronomers, stargazers, watching the celestial bodies go round, across the sky, day after day, month after month, year after year, and so on. And they're now charting the sky. Okay, they're creating calendars because they believe that whatever happened in the sky had an effect on Earth. And they wanted to know what exactly would happen when there was going to be a solar eclipse. They realized that sometimes solar eclipse brought droughts. So they wanted to know when was the time of the next eclipse. Not all eclipses brought droughts. Some eclipses brought plenty of rain. Some eclipses brought flooding. Some eclipses brought war, or they brought plagues, and so on and so forth. So what they're observing is that the sky is very important. There's a relationship with the Earth, and so they're creating, of course, a series of calendars, that are going to tell the rulers what would happen in specific days. Okay, whether it's going to be a proper time for hunting, for fishing, for farming, for conducting warfare, and so on and so forth. And when there was going to be a drought, they will prepare for it. Sometimes they will have to migrate to another area in search for water. So it became essential, again, for Native Americans. Virtually most Native American societies that lived, at least in the village setting, but most importantly in the cities, were very, very aware of the significance of calendars and knowing the days and so on and so forth. So this is one of the contributions of Native American civilizations, is their mathematics, their calendars, their astronomy, their knowledge of the stars, the movements of planets, and calculating, of course, things like eclipses, and of course architecture, the building of cities, like things like pyramids. And this is what we're going to discuss here in point number 5. And that another feature, another characteristic of the Native American civilizations is their monumental architecture and public works. That once they're crowded together, they're living in those urban centers, they're going to be building their cities, and there will be monumental architecture taking place. In other words, massive building of administrative buildings and religious temples, ceremonial centers, shrines, on such a massive scale. Okay, and tens of thousands of people will be working together to produce them. And the public works, things like roads and so on are going to be built also as well. So what's important to note here is that the city that Native Americans built was not just a place where people lived in order to simply carry out their own particular activities. In the old world, for example, when you talk about Europe, when you talk about the Middle East or Asia, cities were built for protection in many cases. People move to a city because this is a place where you find the most effective type of protection possible from barbaric peoples. Okay? And they were always built as with defense walls, they were almost always walled, and there were always people that will inform, the city dwellers when there was again raiders, and there were barbaric tribes approaching, and they will pretty much unite themselves to fight together the intruders, the raiders. So in the old world, the city had that purpose for self-defense as a fortress. But Native Americans built cities for a different purpose. And the Native American city, almost anywhere and everywhere in the Americas, the function or purpose was ceremonial. In other words, that the city was built to build the houses, the shrines, of the gods. And this is where people come to perform rituals, to perform ceremonies that were public, to perform their pilgrimages, people that were visiting from afar away to visit a god that was actually living there in one of the temples. And so this is the main purpose. This is a ceremonial city. That is the purpose. And so Native Americans recreated the sacred landscape, pretty much, that they created, or the sacred landscape that they experienced in the past, and they brought it and created that landscape inside of the city in a man-made way, in a man-made fashion. Okay, so people are going to actually build what was sacred in nature, things like mountains. They recreated a mountain in the form of a pyramid. So the pyramid was actually a mountain. The mountain was sacred because that was really considered to be sacred. The stairways to heaven, this is where you touch the gods and the sky, conduct ceremonies. Well, they build their own mountains in the form of pyramids to house their gods as well. And inside of those pyramids were also inner chambers where the rulers went in to pray, and those symbolized caves. The cave was a sacred space as well that they recreated with the pyramid. Okay, so it's important. Cities were filled with pyramids. Okay, and the pyramid was considered to be a mountain, a sacred mountain, and the priest or ruler will climb to the very top of the mountain in pursuit of a connection or vision with the gods and the goddesses, and he will receive a revelation or a vision, then come back to the ground and reveal it to people. Okay, there were also things like canals, systems, again, diverting water, of course, out of the rivers to water crops. They will build roads to connect the different temples, to connect the different cities with other cities for trade and for pilgrimages purposes, for pilgrimage as well, for religious purposes, and of course a series of administrative buildings. I mean, there's a lot of construction work taking place during this time. During this time, we're also going to see the emergence of divine kings, because those cities were not ruled just by chiefs or elders or ordinary leaders. The leaders of those cities were considered divine beings, descendants of the gods of the sky. For example, the sun god or the planet Venus. And they created the institution of kingship. Okay, so those cities represented at the same time kingdoms, because they were governed by kings, and the king was almost worshipped as a divine being. He was the closest to what a god will be, and he was the closest relative of the gods. Okay, the direct descendant of the gods, him and his family, by the way. So the type of government, of course, that those cities had were theocratic, the kind of states. Those were theocratic states. What is a theocratic state? Is any state in which the political ruler is at the same time a religious figure. And since we're talking about a king, the king, the political ruler who was a king, was at the same time the highest priest of the religion. He was the highest priest. Okay, so there's not a separation of church and state. That is what a theocratic state is, and a state in which the political leaders are the religious leaders at the same time. Okay, so they're the leaders of the church or the leaders of the religion, and all the rituals that people practice, and the representative of the gods, and at the same time they're the rulers. By the way, this is very characteristic of the Native American city during this time that we're talking about. Okay, without exception. The religious system became very, very complex during the agricultural age in those civilizations. We're going to see a host of different gods and goddesses that people worshipped year round, most of which were deeply associated with agriculture, because this is an agricultural civilization. So because it's an agricultural civilization, people are going to now worship those aspects of nature that are essential and vital in the production of crops. In this case, in the production of corn. So the sun is essential for agricultural production. Is considered one of the highest gods, in this regard. The moon, by the way, is also essential in the production of vegetation, in the production of plants. The old religions understood that the moon governs the cycle of plants, the cycle of trees, medicine, and so on and so forth. It was also worshipped as a goddess. It was the rain god, of course. The earth goddess continues to be worshipped as well. And also the corn god. Corn, the plant, becomes a god. In fact, people during this time created myths and legends that told that the human race was created out of corn, that the gods crafted humans in the beginning of time from corn. That was the substance that made humans in the beginning of creation. And one of the most important gods of the agriculturalists that were considered to be one of the most sacred, not that the other gods that I mentioned were not, but the agriculturalists, particularly here in America, worship the four elements. The four elements, the agricultural gods and goddesses, again, whether we're talking about the sun, the moon, rain, earth, corn, and all of the other gods, they all came from the four elements. Even the sun came from the four elements, the moon, the earth, and so on. Because Native Americans believe that all of nature, the universe, is made up of four elements: fire, water, earth, and wind. And those are the four elements that make up creation, and those are the four elements that are necessary to sustain life. You take away any of those elements and you cannot have life. Okay, like an organism, let's say an animal, a plant, human, so on. You need the four elements present there. And they represented the four elements in the form of a cross, each element positioned in different cardinal points. And so the significance of this is that Native Americans already knew about the cross before the coming of the Europeans, and it was present in every city. People worship it because they believe those were the first gods of creation. When creation came into being, there were four gods initially that created everything. The galaxies, they created the planets, they created everything, those four gods. So it's important because when the Europeans arrived and the Europeans showed the natives the cross, many natives converted immediately to Christianity because they saw in the cross their old gods. Okay, so we're going to talk about that, of course, more fully when we reach the colonial period. Just checking our time here. We still have about another 15 minutes or so. Okay, so at any rate, now at this juncture, I just want to talk about some of the major civilizations that flourish in America. So again, this is not for you to have intensive knowledge of each one of them. Just the seven, of course, features that I explain in depth are the ones that you need to know. Intensive, extensive agriculture, corn agriculture, for example, growth, demographic growth, things like urbanism, and so on and so forth. Creation of knowledge, advanced systems of knowledge, the development of monumental architecture and public works, the ceremonial city, including, of course, the divine kings and the theocratic states, as well as the last, of course, feature we discussed, and of course that is the complex religious system that is arising during this time, the agricultural gods and goddesses and the sacred cross. That's important because all of those 7 elements are going to be present in each one of the civilizations that I'm going to discuss here. So they created those features in their civilizations in different degrees, in different forms, if you will, but all of those features were present in each one of them. Okay, so let me just talk about the major highly advanced civilizations of the Americas, and we start with the Olmec. The Olmec civilization began to rise around 8000 BC. Now, of course, they have been experimenting with agriculture for many, many, many centuries in the past, beginning the process of agricultural production, but it is not until 1800 BC that there's a group of people that today we know of as the Olmecs that are beginning to create their cities, and there's population growth there on such a grand scale, and everything we talked about again in just the previous segment is going to start taking place now in full scale around 1800 BC, and they're going to build their civilization for the coming centuries, and they're going to actually disappear, if you will, from sight around 250 BC. So this is kind of the lifespan of the Olmec civilization, and it's considered to be the mother culture of Middle America. It's called Mesoamerica. Mesoamerica is Middle America. In Middle America, we're going to see the flourishing of the most advanced, the highly advanced civilizations, and the Olmecs are considered to be the root of all the other groups. Some historians even suggest that the Olmecs were the forerunners of all the other civilizations of the Americas, by the way. There's perhaps indication that they took that knowledge elsewhere, that some Olmecs migrated to different parts of the American continent, took their knowledge and seeded that knowledge in different regions, and we're going to see, of course, other civilizations flourishing elsewhere. So this is the mother culture of Middle America, and they're going to be the forerunners once again of the cities, the pyramid building, the ceremonial centers. Rulers will be revered and worshipped as divine beings. The kings again are going to actually rule those cities and be worshipped as divine beings. They created mathematics, they created calendars, medicine, artwork, and so on and so forth. And they even use certain gemstones as currency for their trade, and so on and so forth. This is, again, large monuments that they left as portraits of the rulers of those cities. Some of them exhibit features from peoples, let's say, from Africa or from parts of Asia. So they do have distinct features from peoples from other regions. This is another Olmec ruler who has a very Asian-like facial feature, by the way. So this is very, very early on. Again, the very first highly advanced civilization that appears on the scene in the American continent. They're actually considered to be the forerunners, the ancestors of the Maya. We're going to just get there in just a a few minutes. So San Lorenzo, this is a city that they built, so you can have just an idea. Again, 1700 BC. You have, of course, different temples, different pyramids, in which people conducted ceremonies, and this is where the rulers actually lived. And in the surrounding areas, there were presumably thousands and thousands of villagers and peasants that produced the crops to sustain the city, and to, of course, apply the work that was needed to build those monuments as well. So again, this is in a region of southeast Mexico, what today is present-day Veracruz. This is where they actually created their civilization. So there's yet another highly advanced civilization that came almost at the same time when the Olmecs began to disappear, 250 BC. That's why some historians suggest that the Olmecs did not really disappear. They probably left the area and went into different directions and began to create, different, expressions of their own culture in different parts of the American continent, and they became known as different peoples. For example, in central Mexico, what today is Mexico City, there's going to be a civilization known as Teotihuacan. The Teotihuacanos, they were called. The word Teotihuacan is the land where the gods walked, or the gods were born. So the legends indicate that the people that built Teotihuacan were not ordinary people. They were really wise people. That the priests, the astronomers, the mathematicians, the architects, the rulers were very, very wise, very intelligent. And people have memories again of that era in their legends. There are historians that suggest that the peoples of Teotihuacan are the peoples that we know of today as the Toltecs. So there's a strong indication that the people of Teotihuacan that build the civilization in central Mexico, in the Valley of Mexico, are simply the Toltecs, even though during this time that we're talking about, 2500 BC to 650 AD, this is the lifespan of that civilization, that this civilization was no other than the ancient Toltecs. Okay, so there is just a discrepancy whether they were Teotihuacanos or Toltecs, but for some historians they're one and the same. And they're considered to be the forerunners of ancient Mexico. Okay, so if you want to study the civilization, the ancient civilizations of Mexico, and who were the forerunners, the builders of ancient Mexico, you will go back to Teotihuacan, you will go back to the Toltecs, and this is the area where they thrived and built their cities, their pyramid temples, and so on and so forth. So they ruled that area for over 800 years. Okay, from 250 BC to 650 AD, more or less. Some of their major cities are still intact today. Teotihuacan, outside of Mexico City, about 15-20 miles outside of Mexico City, you can still find Teotihuacan. Their major capital is there. It's a gigantic structure. The Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon are visited by tourists. Hundreds and thousands of tourists every year go there. The City of the Gods, as it is called again, major tourist attraction. So you can see the city is a marvel, indeed, of architecture. You can see, again, this is a massive structure, gigantic in size and scope. You can see perhaps the people that are besides it. They're tiny compared to the structure. So this is something, again, a work of wonder. How is it that they built such a large monument dedicated to the sun god in this case? All right, so there's two more civilizations I want to actually discuss, and one is, of course, the Maya of Central America, and also they thrive in areas of present-day the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. Okay, and they thrive roughly between 250. Once again, this is a very important year because 250 BC is when the Olmecs disappeared from the scene, but yet other civilizations are flourishing, like the Teotihuacanos or Toltecs in central Mexico, and the Mayas of the Yucatan in Central America at the same time. The Mayas thrived for over 1,000 years, all the way to 900 AD. They pretty much ceased their construction work, if you will. They ceased to live in cities, as we'll see in just a few seconds. They built about 25 cities, what we call city-states or kingdoms, cities that were gigantic, each governed by a king, by the way. And it is estimated that throughout this region, that in which we're going to see those 25 Mayan cities, again in Central America, the Yucatan Peninsula, they built over 29,000 different structures, in which most of those structures were temples, religious temples, pyramids of all sizes. Some of them were gigantic in size, some of them were medium, others were just shrines. There were small scale construction works dedicated for lesser gods and so on and so forth. Platforms of all kinds, where people worship their gods. They're all scattered across, again, the regions. Monumental construction work taking place. Of course, they took about 1,000 years or so to do that, but still, this is a feat to take into account in terms of the grand civilizations of the Americas again. So again, this is a typical Mayan ruler of one of those cities that exhibit very, very strong Asian features, Chinese again in this case. So it's still a mystery, as to where the Mayas came from, the origins of those people. One of the most famous, of course, pyramids is the pyramid in the Yucatan Peninsula, in the city of Chichen Itza in the Yucatan. And one of the things that we learn from the Mayas is that the pyramids were not just temples. They were, but they were not just temples in which, where they house their gods and the rulers will go on top in order to conduct ceremonies and rituals, which they did, by the way. But the Mayas show us that the pyramids were also calendars made of stone to mark the beginning of seasons. So, for example, in this pyramid, on March 21st, the beginning of March, the beginning of spring, by the way, March 21st, we see around 1 o'clock that the angle from one side of the pyramid and the stairway of one side of the pyramid began to show a light shadow spectacle of a serpent that is made of light, that by 3:30 p.m. it joins the massive stone head located at the very bottom, indicating the beginning of spring, that a serpent descends from the sky to fertilize the soil, announcing the beginning of the rains and the preparation of the fields for cultivation, for agriculture. And so the priests, also the engineers, build the monument to mark the seasons, okay, with certain light shadow effects that will take place on specific days, and only in that day you see that effect. So again, those were actually calendars that people used to know when was the beginning of of the season. So the fourth civilization, it is in North America. So again, we're moving quickly here. So yeah, we just have a few minutes. So the fourth civilization, the last one, is the Mississippians. This is very important because when the colonists, well, in this case the settlers, arrived from England to North America, to the East Coast, and as they settle and move into the mainland in North America, they encounter the descendants there of a civilization that existed centuries back, known as the Mississippians, as they're called mound builders. So this was another great, highly advanced civilization that flourished in the American continent, in this case in North America, and around the Mississippi Valley, extending all the way to the Ohio Valley in the Great Lakes region, by the way. Hundreds of densely populated cities they built. They were very advanced, by the way, in that there was a lot of construction work, city building, monumental architecture taking place. They had their complex societies that had ranks, a rank system in which people were organized around certain groupings, or that occupied a certain position in society, like the peasantry at the bottom, and then we got the merchants coming after them, and then the warrior class after that, and of course at the very top we're going to see the rulers. And there were specialized classes. Some of them were conducting trade, others were artisans, and so on and so forth. So they were highly organized, again, in North America. Again, this is a region of North America in which you're going to find the mound builders, the Mississippians. In this case, they also build ceremonial temples, but instead of building them like the Mayas or the Teotihuacanos or the Olmecs from rocks and stone and building those pyramids, they actually took the mountains that were already there and shaped them in a way that they looked like pyramids, with stairways on different sides, and they created temples on top of them. And inside of the mountains, they bury their dead, inside of the mountains. So it is extremely important that they use the landscape to build a city around it and shape the mountain in a way that it will resemble a pyramid. Thousands of mounds were turned into temples and burials, such as this one, for example. This is just, again, a sketch that shows you mountains. Those were natural formations, actual mountains in which they actually carved in a way that they pretty much showed at the end of the day like actual pyramids with platforms and different shrines and so on and so forth. So again, there were scattered hundreds of those monuments scattered across the landscape. Cahokia was one of the most important cities of the Mississippians. It housed 30,000 people, and it was abandoned in the year 900 AD. By the way, it's another sketch that show. You might see, those are pyramids, but those are actually mountains. Again, that look like pyramids because that's the way they shaped them and used them for ceremonial purposes, by the way. Now, we arrived to the very end of our discussion, and this is one last aspect. It's going to take us a few minutes, and that is that after 900 AD, Native American civilizations underwent a dramatic shift and transformation that today is simply known as the collapse. The collapse. What the collapse is that there was an environmental phenomenon taking place around the world. Climate change, if you will. This is a phenomenon that is cyclical, if you will. The Earth goes through cycles. Some cycles are cool cycles, others are warm cycles, or alternating cycles of cool and warm weather, if you will, or climates, again, that affect the globe. By 900 AD, what we see is a cool cycle, the coming of a cool cycle, in that this cool cycle affected weather patterns all over the world, in that there's less and less rain. Why? Because there's less water being evaporated. Of course, there's less heat in the environment. So therefore, as the earth is now cooling, it's not freezing, but it's cooling, there's less rain. Less rain means there's the experience of droughts in many areas of the globe. And when there's droughts, there's less food available, less vegetation to feed animals, there's less water for agriculture, and with less food production, less animal species, less agricultural production, there's of course famine. So the large population centers that had existed in the Americas are on decline. Okay, so people cannot live anymore in those areas because you cannot actually produce food to sustain tens of thousands of people. So the rulers, the kings that were considered divine, lost their political legitimacy because they were unable to bring rain. You know, why is it that if they're connected to the gods, why is it that they cannot bring rain? So people began to consider that perhaps those kings were not all that divine. So, you know, we see also the institution of divine kingship. You know, the kings considered to be divine are coming to an end. Even the kings abandon the cities. And the cities are abandoned. All across the Americas, there is this phenomenon that all of the large cities, the ceremonial centers, are being abandoned almost simultaneously in everywhere. The Mississippians abandoned them in North America, abandoned their cities. The Mayas abandoned their cities around 900 AD. Whether we're talking about the peoples of central Mexico, like the Toltecs and so on, they're beginning to abandon those cities on such a large scale. There's only very few of those cities that remain in operation, so to speak. Very few, but the vast majority are being abandoned by the people, and they become abandoned totally. And in many cases, the jungle takes over and covers them with foliage and jungle and trees. So when the Europeans arrived in 1492 and after that year to the Americas, they're not going to know that once upon a time, centuries back, there were great civilizations that flourished in the Americas. They were Native Americans. Many of them actually lived in villages, some of them in some cities, but they're not going to see the splendor, the golden age of Native American civilizations. They're not. They're not going to know. So what happens, of course, after 900 AD, all the way to 1492, is that a new era begins. This is called the post-classic era. Post-classic means because the classic age, the golden age of Native American civilizations comes so close. So this is the post-classic. This is the era that came after the classic era, the golden age, if you will. And here, people return to the village. Okay, the vast majority of the people that live in the cities return to the village life. They're living in, for the most part, in villages governed by chiefs. So instead of being led by kings, we go back to the time when people were simply governed by a chief, in this case. And because resources are scarce, because food's scarce, and in water reservoirs and resources are also quite limited during this time, there's going to be intense competition between the villagers, between the different chiefs, and we're going to see the rise of warfare, for example. I think it's very important that the post-classic was an age in which people abandoned the way of life of the city, went to the village, but there's intense competition for the limited resources available. And of course, the rise of the Aztecs, of course, is the clear example of this development of the post-classic. The Aztecs were nomads, hunters and gatherers that came from the north. They came from places like present-day Colorado in the United States, looking for food, looking for water. They're going to get to central Mexico in 1260 AD, and they're going to conquer, of course, the Toltecs of central Mexico, because they were warriors, very skilled. They're going to actually conquer the agricultural societies of central Mexico and build an empire. The Aztec Empire is on the rise from 1260 to 1521, when it collapsed. Of course, we're going to get there, and the conquest of the Aztecs by the Spaniards. So again, when the Spaniards arrived and saw the Aztecs, they thought that all Native Americans were just like the Aztecs, that they were warlike, they conducted human sacrifice and so on and so forth. And the Spaniards were simply horrified at, again, this type of civilization. But at any rate, so this concludes our topic on the history of Native American history, culture, and religion. You see just the questions at the very end. They're to guide you. Those questions are there to prepare you for the exam. It's a study guide, so you know exactly what to study for. Okay, so I gave you 3 sessions, 3 lectures on this topic, and so now what you need to do is just review your notes, look at those questions, and see exactly what you need to study for. Okay, that's all I have for you. And we conclude then session 3 of this topic on Native American history, culture, and religion. The second topic we start next week, and I'll announce the title when we return. Okay, bye-bye.